Hey guys, hope everybody's doing okay. So, greetings from the home office, and we're going to try this because technology always a strength of mine, as many of you may know. Um, Thank you to my assistant videographer and tech specialist Joseph, who's 13 and understands these things. So, hope you guys are doing good. It's my first crack at doing this as a online thing. Again, you heard that already. So, if you're following along with regard to the lecture outlines, you'd want to grab the lecture on the 1920s. Um, and I'm in the today. What I'm going to cover is the intro slash post-war upheaval part of the lecture, which usually I'll spend a whole day on 1919 because it was just that important of a year. So I was going to go through a bunch of this stuff today. Your textbook will talk about a lot of this. It may not talk about other things. It may raise some points I don't raise. I may raise some points it does not raise. That's how this is supposed to work anyway, right? Okay, so I won't take attendance today. Um, so let me just get started talking here. So to pick up, when we talk about this is kind of really World War One Part Two. I mean, if you want to think about it, um, for what it really is, right? I mean, this is sort of this transitional, this sort of bridge that takes us from what World War One was, what it caused, what it destroyed, which is an older Western civilization, and starts to begin to bridge um, the United States as well as the Western world and the colonial world. And here I'm talking about Africa and India and Vietnam and other parts of the world that have been part of French and British and German colonization, begins to bridge them toward their futures as well of decolonization, right? Because these people in places like Africa and Asia have been hearing from the colonial powers how superior their civilizations are, right? How superior the West is. Um, we bring you medicine, we bring you hospitals, we bring you roads, we bring you our religion, we bring you all these things because we come from this superior civilization. But what happened was a lot of people from India and a lot of people from Africa um, get drafted into colonial armies um, by Britain, by France, and get brought to the Western Front, get brought to the trenches and fight there. Excuse me. And um, that's their introduction to Western civilization, this civilization that they've been hearing about for the last 30 to 60 years, and how great it is. And they see mud and rats and body parts and death everywhere. And that's their introduction to the West. Introduction to the West. And people in these places go, "Oh, really? Um, we think we want to get rid of the West and go back to living the way we were." So it really accelerates the decolonization process in a lot of these places as well. Most of that doesn't come to fruition until after World War II, but the seeds of it are planted by this war. Okay, so that's very important. So let's pick up on Wilson's 14 points because I think that's a good place to get us started here. Woodrow Wilson, in his 14 points for peace, had laid out a number of ideas, uh, propositions, if you will, for the Western powers to think about a way to settle their war, right? And when the Paris Peace Conference was about to happen, it was Wilson who was trying to push the European powers to settle the war, to draw out a treaty based upon the 14 points. Okay, so some of those were self-determination of peoples, right, which meant people could have their own nation based on their own reason for nationalism, right? So if you study nationalism, which I did as a minor field, um, nations are built on political theory, United States. Nations are built on a religious similarity. Nations can be built upon an ethnic similarity. Nations can be built upon a common folklore and heritage and culture, right? So there are myriad sort of components that go into the composition of any people's particular nationalism and why they say they're a nation. Okay, it's not a one size fits all thing. Um, but the ability for people to determine for themselves who will govern them is what's meant by self determination of peoples. So this spoke especially to people in the Ottoman Empire under Turkish rule, right? So Armenian people, Arab people, North African people, Lebanese, Syrian, right? All these different people who had been under the control of the Ottoman Empire of Turkey. This spoke to them. To the people in the polyglot, which means many tongued or many languaged Austro Hungarian Empire, you had Serbians, you had Croatians, you had Slovenians, you had all kinds of folks, Czechs, Slovaks, um, all Bosnians, all living under the rule of Austria and Hungary. So this too spoke to sort of the Balkan Mountains is that area of southeastern Europe, a Balkan nationalism, right? So hope for those people for their future. Another big part was freedom of the seas. Freedom of the seas, freedom of trade. This meant that no country could limit other nations' access to what were called by Jefferson the great highways of the world, right? Um, Freedom of the seas was denied to the United States, from our perspective, by German submarine warfare. And so we were arguing that and this is one of the principal reasons that we went to war. So, in fact, it was very much one of the principal reasons we had gone to war in 1812 as well. So this was sort of a revisitation 100 years later of some of the same root causes of the 1812 war with Britain, where France and Britain were preventing us from navigating the oceans of the world. Well, now we had Germany and Britain trying to make rules. Germany blockading Britain, blockading Germany, saying we couldn't go there. Germany blockading Britain, saying we couldn't go there. Right. So again, this issue of freedom of the seas was a major point that the United States said this should always just be taken for granted. Another big thing was universal arms reduction, right? Another was no secret treaties between nations. During the war, Italy, as you remember, was part of the Triple Alliance, decided not to go to war because Germany and Austria started the war from their opinion. They thought they had signed one for a defensive treaty. In other words, if any of us are attacked, we'll all go to war. But in this case, they felt as though Germany was responsible for the war. So Italy backed out when the war started. But then Britain signed a secret deal with the Italians to bring them into the war on the Allied side in 1915, promising them parts of Austrian territory, some nice ski resorts up there in the Alpine region, the borders between Italy and Austria, which was done underhandedly, right? So there was a provision there would be none of these secret treaties. Modification of colonial claims. This would be where things like France and Germany, let's say, laid claim to the Cameroons. So in South, no, I guess it would be in northeastern Africa, on the sort of, where Africa is very round to the western part of Africa, where it looks sort of like a pork chop. And you go around the circle. Under that bottom part there is where the Cameroons were located, and France and Germany each had a colonial claim: German Cameroon, French Cameroon. So there were some border disputes there. France and Britain had almost gone to war in 1875 over a remote sort of outpost in northeastern sub-Saharan Africa called Fashoda. It's known in history, and you can look that up, Fashoda, if you want to Google it on Wikipedia, the Fashoda incident. Almost a war between Britain and France over that. Thank goodness, I think they had a telegraph at that time that helped them to resolve that problem. And then the big one that Woodrow Wilson pushed for was a League of Nations. The League of Nations was going to be a sort of international congress that each nation would send delegates to. The purpose of this was to prevent future wars. So it was the precursor to our modern United Nations. But the League of Nations was originally, it was an idea Wilson had for quite a while, part of his sort of progressive political thought. And the idea was that there would be this international body if there were grievances against any particular nation for its conduct toward another nation. Then a nation could bring a claim against the aggressor, let's call it. And then the League of Nations would make a decision, which would then be binding upon all nations, right? So the idea of this was an international cooperative body to prevent future wars. So this was a very idealistic, very sort of a utopian kind of idea by Wilson. I want to try. I don't know if that's that helped. Did that help a little? Not. Yeah, I think it's a little less clear. So I think this helped, encourage folks toward a brighter future in some ways, but there were some real gaps in this treaty proposal here for a League of Nations, right? So let's talk about the Versailles Treaty. Basically, eventually the war ends. Eventually, this treaty is signed. Um, Wilson gets himself into some political trouble with this treaty. Wilson goes to France, disappears actually to Europe. He tours Europe. Uh, he stops in Italy. He stops in England before coming to Paris for the peace conference. It was held in the Palace of Versailles, which was the palace built by Louis XIV, the Sun King, back in the 1600s. Very grand place, about 12 miles outside of Paris. Great tourist destination still. And it was held in the famous Hall of Mirrors there. Wilson left, first time an American president had ever done this, left the United States for 6 months to go to Europe. I think your textbook talked about this. And made the mistake of not bringing any Republicans with him. So he took this enormous sort of entourage with him to do this sort of victory lap around Europe, where he was hailed by many people as, a savior, a guy who had brought peace to Europe after 4 years of hell, right? So Wilson was very popular with the Europeans, but he really angered people in the United States, particularly Republicans, right? Because we are a nation with two parties, right? And Republicans had fought and died too. Republicans had lost children in the war. Republicans had passed legislation, had approved his war proclamation, et cetera. In fact, they had been pushing him for preparedness and war sooner than he wanted to get there. But now he was sort of throwing shade on them, keeping them out of the victory lap. And so this really angered people. The other was that there was a staunch opposition to his idea of a League of Nations. And that's part of the documents that I asked you guys to read about this week, right? Were the two opposing sides on this League of Nations deal. Now, the guy that really opposed him was Henry Cabot Lodge, who at this point you should know was Wilson's chief political adversary. He was the longtime chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the most powerful Republican in either house of Congress. And Lodge and Wilson were political foes, right? So he will lead the charge against Wilson. I know the document you're reading is from George Norris. In our old reader I used to use for this course, there was a document by Lodge opposing the treaty, but you'll see the basic reasons for that. So for Wilson, ultimately, he won't give up the League of Nations, the idea for that. So the United States is willing to approve the treaty because remember, all treaties, all foreign treaties to which the United States becomes a signatory must be approved by the Senate. The House doesn't deal with that part of foreign policy, right? There's no House Foreign Policy Committee. It's a Senate Foreign Relations Committee, right? So the Senate has to approve all treaties. And they're willing to take the treaty, but not with the League of Nations. So the war's over. Wilson has come up with this whole League of Nations idea, pushed for these principles. And the Europeans have rejected a number of them, but the Europeans are willing to sign on for the League of Nations. Americans aren't. The Republicans in the Senate oppose this and won't sign off on it. So for Woodrow Wilson, from what we learned about him, hopefully you've read the lecture I posted for you last week. Son of a minister, extremely self-righteous, an extreme intellectual who always believed he was the smartest guy in the room. He knew better than everyone else. And for him, public issues were moral issues. If Wilson felt strongly about something, it was because he had both the intellectual and the moral high ground. Okay. And so for him, anything that was public was moral. So there was a moral failure by Republicans in his eyes, rather than practical foreign policy considerations having to do with our sovereignty, which he felt were leading them to oppose the treaty. Secondly, Wilson was intransigent about his ideas for the League of Nations and the 14 points. He wouldn't change a word of it because it was perfect, because he thought of it. Okay, so so students, if professors are ever trying to help you edit a paper, follow their direction. Okay, sometimes there are words, and we believe it's hard to write words, and we fall in love with our words, but sometimes we need guidance, right? Wilson would not take guidance, just not in his DNA. Okay, so he takes no congressional Republicans with him to the conference. He's unwilling to change a word of his proposals, and what happens is the Senate rejects it. Okay, so Wilson decides to sort of circumvent the will of the Senate. Right? He believes that the people actually would vote differently if he gave them the chance. So in 1919, he goes on a tour, like a sort of like Andrew Johnson did. You'll remember his swing around the circle tour, where he went campaigning off the back of a train around the Northeast and Midwest to go for Democratic candidates in 1866. In this case, Wilson decides he's going to take his case for the League of Nations directly to the American people and solicit their support for it. So he goes on this train and he starts and he's going across the country, giving 10, 12 speeches a day off the back of a train, encouraging people to support this League of Nations. Now, Wilson is not a young man. He's in his 60s at this point. And he's working at a pace and speaking with a vigor and a passion, that are taking a lot of energy out of him. And the president always travels with a personal physician. And the doctor's warning him, Mr. President, you've got to back it down here. You're going to, wreck your health doing this. You can't keep up this pace at your age. This is not a good idea. Well, he doesn't listen. He doesn't listen to his doctor. And on September 25th, 1919, he's giving one of these speeches off the train platform in Pueblo, Colorado, and he is stricken. I guess one is stricken by a stroke. He has a massive stroke and collapses. And it is a irreversible stroke. Today, I mean, this is what my wife does for a living. They have something they can give you called TPA. So if you ever know someone who's having a stroke, if you call right away and get them to an emergency room, within the first few hours, they can give you something called TPA that can reverse the effects of a stroke. This was not there for Woodrow Wilson. His stroke was so bad, he was permanently paralyzed, bedridden and wheelchair bound for the rest of his life after this. So it really was the end of both his political career and his much of his personal life, his ability to ever live his life in a normal way again. So he remained president because 1920 would be an election year. He would not have run for re-election. There would have been a different candidate, but he would have at least served out his term until March of 1921, when there would have been an inauguration. But because of this stroke that occurred in September, for the next 18 months, Wilson's wife really is running the business of the country for him. He's giving instruction to her, and she's working with the cabinet members to keep the country running. So it's one of the interesting stories in American history. They would say there's never been a woman president of the United States. But during these 18 months, Mrs. Wilson very much acted in the capacity as the president in concert with Wilson's advisors and cabinet. So sad end to the political career of Woodrow Wilson. The United States never joins the League of Nations, and we'll see what happens with the League of Nations when we get to talk about the 1930s and the foreign policy issues of the 1930s. We'll see how well the League of Nations worked. Hint, there's a World War II, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the economy of the United States. So moving to part two of this talk about the post-war upheaval. So that's sort of how the war and the treaty plays out. Then I'm going to talk about the economy and a little bit about the things going on in American society at this time. So with respect to the economy, looking back at the textbook chapter on the war, and I did not go too much into this in my lecture, but I would refer you to your textbook, which talks a little bit about the War Industries Board and the degree to which progressive politicians at this time sort of mobilized, organized the American economy and society in order to meet the needs of the war. So there was a great level of sort of government control of business, social function, information through the what's it called, George Creel and the Public Information Committee on Public Information, CPI. So you had government control, very tough government control of a lot of things. You had the passage of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which controlled speech, journalism. So there were a very, very high level of government control. The National War Labor Board intervenes, creates an 8-hour day, equal pay for women, recognizes union rights. That was in 1918. Herbert Hoover had been in charge of the Food Administration, which pushed for certain days of the week where you didn't eat pork, certain days of the week where you didn't eat meat, certain days of the week you stayed away from certain products in order to preserve a decent amount of these things for the troops and for feeding people in Europe. Bernard Baruch, who was a very well-known New York financier, was placed in charge of the War Industries Board. And the War Industries Board, which was created in July of 1917, determined which companies were going to produce what and what the prices would be, and then who would get the products once they were produced. So you're hearing right now, if you're paying attention to news cycles, that President Trump has initiated, but not necessarily enacted and enforced on, well, he did on GM, the Defense Production Act, which was a law passed during the Korean War. So this is sort of very similar to that, but this was, at this point, President Trump's trying to get particular products produced for the medical crisis. And you have a lot of companies that are just stepping up and doing it voluntarily at this point. But GM was trying to sort of rake the government over the coals for the prices of these ventilators, and President Trump dropped the hammer on them and invoked the Defense Production Act to make them give a reasonable price. Well, this is very much what this War Industries Board did in 1917. They just told you what you were making. They told you how much you would charge, and they said where it went. It was complete government control. In some ways, it's socialistic experimentation. I mean, the United States really, during the First World War, was a great social laboratory. And I think that was the term used by James Weinstein in his 1969 book on this. So the Committee on Public Information, this was George Creel, led that up. And basically, it called on journalists to self-censor themselves. And a government version of War Facts was produced for public consumption. And then there were posters, films, all sorts of government. It was a government propaganda ministry, essentially, if we want to just call it what it was. Government propaganda ministry that was created. Franklin Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, was a Democratic politician at this time in New York. And when he will later move with his New Deal program, he will take great example from what the United States had done during the First World War to mobilize in a rapid amount of time to deal with getting ready to go fight that war, right? Just inheriting a peacetime system and having to rapidly try to convert it to go to war, which is some of what we're trying to do right now to deal with this medical crisis, right? Women had a very important role in the economy during this time, because with men going into the army by the hundreds of thousands, jobs were opened up. So many women enter the workforce. There's a great book on this, on the First World War, that I read as a grad student. A really interesting book, well written too. It's called Women, War, and Work by Maureen Greenwald. Uh, Maureen spelled Maurine, Greenwald. Excellent book, talking about how women went into the war industries, not just producing um, weapons of war, but working as telegraphers, working as phone operators, working as cable car conductors, um, running telegraph offices. So it shows how many different areas of the economy that women. We usually think of Rosie the Riveter in World War II. We don't really think about what was women's work experience in the First World War, but we see actually through that book what a vital role they played. Um, during the war effort, and then the changes in their lives when the men come home and get their jobs back, and the women are then sent back to, in many cases, back to the domestic sphere. And this, of course, is segueing with the movement for women's voting rights. So that sort of desire for the vote is sort of dovetailing with this transition from what they felt was profitable and meaningful work time, a wartime uh, work that was helping the country, to being sent back to sometimes what they saw as less meaningful work, depending on the woman, of course, and her views and values. But from the position of the author, that was the position of the author. Right? Okay, any questions? All right, so let's move on. Part three here. I gotta keep myself amused here. All right. Um, So let's talk about society. So things that were going on in American society at this time. Some of this was during the war. Some of this is a little after the war. So one of them was the repression of German Americans. Your textbook talked about this. The idea that German culture was being sort of stamped on, stomped on to a certain degree, right? It talked about the fact that German textbooks, German language textbooks, and things like that were being burned in bonfires. Um, Talked about the fact that sauerkraut, was canned sauerkraut was being relabeled Liberty cabbage, right? Um, Hamburgers and Frankfurters became Liberty sausage and Liberty sandwiches, right? They got rid of anything with a German name to it. Sadly, dachshunds, right? Those little hot dog dogs that um, some people own, cute little dogs, were being stoned. People throwing rocks at them and killing them in the streets if people were out walking a dachshund because it was a German dog. So I mean, people really went overboard with this, right? And for myself, I look back and wonder what that was like for members of my family who were here. My father, or my grandfather, I should say, Frederick Martin Schroeder, his and his brother Emil were sons of a German immigrant. They were born in, my grandfather was born in 1913. So he would have been a little kid during the First World War. But his father um, was a German immigrant. And so, we call him Grosspop. He was Grossvater is the German word for grandfather. So we wonder what that was like for them living here in New Jersey at that time. I don't know. I never heard stories that they were subjected to any of that. My grandfather and his brother went and fought in World War II for the United States, of course. And, his brother actually was killed off the coast of Italy by a German dive bomber that sunk the Navy ship he was on. So, ironies of life in the Western world. Anyway, so there was repression of German Americans, repression of American socialists. Um, Socialism was a foreign imported political theory that, as I mentioned in my lecture that I posted for you last week, sowed seeds of anti-war dissent. Right, the socialists were about um, the working class. They were about class warfare, not warfare between nations. For them, everything was between the classes that owned the haves and the have-nots. Right, those who owned the means of production and those who did not. Right, the battle between labor and capital. So for them, they viewed the First World War as just a war between the capitalist classes, right? The upper classes of France, the upper classes of Germany, the upper classes of Britain, the United States, the master class. They were the ones who were fighting this war and forcing the proletariat, the workers, to kill each other. So they opposed the war theoretically. As I mentioned to you in my lecture, the prior to World War I, you had the French socialist Jean Jaurès out there in the streets of Paris begging people not to fight the war, begging France to stay out, begging the workers not to enlist. But if you read the work of Marc Ferrand, the French historian who wrote the book on the Great War, 1914 and 1918, which is translated into English, you'll read that in these opening chapters, as soon as the war was declared, the French socialists went and signed up for the army in droves because their nationalism trumped their socialism. Anyway, but American socialists, removed from the action, were trying to keep us from getting into it. And they were involved in many, many acts of sabotage, work slowdowns, labor slowdowns, groups like the Industrial Workers of the World. And I did my undergraduate honors thesis, actually, when I was a Rutgers Camden student, on the Industrial Workers of the World and German undercover activity in the United States in the First World War. So the IWW was organizing strikes all over the United States, acts of sabotage, attempted acts of murder. They actually attempted to kill the governor of California and the governor. I think they did kill the governor of Idaho back in the 1905 era. Mailbox bombs was their specialty. So, in the same fashion that I mentioned the Preparedness Day bombing in my lecture in 1916, this was the IWW's stock and trade. I mean, these people were referred to as bomb throwers because they were precisely that. To crack down on all this sort of dissent, and there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of it very sympathetic. I mean, if you read literature on the IWW, a lot of it was written in the late 1960s when America was very radicalized, right? So you can read books by people like Melvin Dubofsky that are highly sympathetic to the IWW, the Wobblies as they were called. But I've also done a lot of hardcore research in the National Archives on their activities, and not all of it is as cute and cuddly as certain authors would have you want to think. Americans just kind of love radicals and rebels, and that's why they get glamorized, right? That's why people still wear Che Guevara T-shirts. Don't ask me why. How many people have been killed in Cuban prisons? People run around with Che Guevara T-shirts. Help me, okay? Anyway, we got the Espionage and Sedition Act. So Woodrow Wilson, therefore, passes. Congress passes a couple of laws that make it, number one, cracking down on spy activity in the United States, and secondly, the Sedition Act, which is an espionage, sort of, makes sense, right? We're going to seriously take spy activity seriously in time of war, sabotage, things like that. That makes sense. The Sedition Act kind of harkened back to the Alien and Sedition Acts of the John Adams administration in 1798. And it made it a crime to libel Wilson or Congress, right? So any newspaper editors, people in the streets, anyone talking out against the war, against Wilson, or against Congress could be thrown in jail. And this happened, right? So this was serious curb of civil liberties and the Bill of Rights that took place under the Wilson administration. The strikes would continue. The government went into all sorts of investigatory mode after the war. There was a major investigation when the war ended of brewers, German brewers, and Bolshevik activity in the United States. There was a big congressional committee that did a major investigation of money laundering by American breweries, funneling money overseas to Bolsheviks and to the German government. Actually, if you ever go to the Free Library of Philadelphia, they have all of it on microcard, all of the files from this investigation, which again I looked at when I was a junior or a senior at Rutgers many years ago. But it's all over there in Philadelphia if you ever want to look at it. It's interesting stuff. There were a number of strikes, as I mentioned. The biggest occurred in 1919, which was the Seattle General Strike, where they essentially shut the whole city down. So the radical labor unions were really on the march at this time, emboldened to some degree by the successful revolutions in Russia, and hoping to bring about, revolution here as well. I mean, it's going on around the world. So these strikes were shut down by the Seattle police. The government restored order, but this sort of opened the door for what we will call the Red Scare of this time period. There was a great concern with the activities of communists, socialists, anarchists, IWW members, and others. And so and I asked you to read these documents, by the way, in your reader this week. A. Mitchell Palmer, who was then the Attorney General, um, uh, launched a bunch of investigations. They broke into Socialist and Communist Party IWW offices all over the United States, seized their printing presses for their publications, seized their files, broke up the furniture, locked people up in jail. In one case, there was a oh my gosh, I'm trying to remember the name of the book. Aliens and Dissent, I believe, was the title of the book. We have it in our law school library, which talks very, very closely about all this. Um, but they actually got a ship in New York Harbor and rounded up, I think it was about 1,800. And I'm not looking at anything I looked at recently. This is research I did when I was younger. They rounded up about 1,800 avowed communists in the United States, put them on a boat, and shipped them to Russia. They dropped them off in Helsinki, in Finland. They said, if it's that great over there, go. And they loaded them on a boat and shipped them there forcibly. So some stuff you could not imagine was going on in America during the 1919-1920 period. Very, very volatile period in our history. Just at the same time that prohibition is starting up too, right? I mean, you've just got a lot of cross currents of radical activity by people, radical activity by government, radical activity by what will become organized crime. There's just all kinds of stuff going on. So another big portion of this period was the results of the Great Migration. So we had one document that I asked you to look at this week from W.E.B. Du Bois, the famous Black civil rights activist and author and historian as well, wrote a great volume on Reconstruction, which I will warn you is close to 700 pages, but it's called Black Reconstruction in America, which he published in 1935, which is a really, really great study of the Reconstruction era. That if you ever are a grad student studying that time period, you'll have to read that. Um, so, uh, but anyway, so that's talking about Black soldiers coming back from Europe and assuming, you know, a position of equity in American society. Well, your textbook talked about, and we'll look at some documents related to the Great Migration in the next unit, because that's the way the reader parsed them out, right? So they're in the 1920s unit for some reason. But the Great Migration is where, when you have a lot of white Northern workers who are leaving to go fight in the war, jobs open up in the Northern economy. So there's a wholesale recruiting by American companies of labor from the South. And there are labor recruiting bureaus. They set up offices in North Carolina, in Virginia, in Mississippi. And these are some of the areas where they're recruiting Black Southerners to come north and take jobs in northern factories and businesses to fill the vacancies left by whites who had gone to join the army. So, and it's kind of interesting, these were sort of regionalized too, so that New York recruiters tended to go to Virginia. Philadelphia recruiters tended to recruit in North Carolina. Chicago recruiters recruited in Mississippi. So you have, interestingly, over time, generationally, you have these family connections between Black Virginians and New Yorkers, in Philadelphians and North Carolinians, Chicagoans and Mississippians, because of these original patterns of recruitment from the Great Migration period. Um, well, what happened was, of course, many of these. So, what happens is Black Southerners move to the North by millions, take jobs, um, settle in neighborhoods, and have children and buy homes and or rent homes and apartments, buy, rent, whatever their particular condition allowed them to do. But what happens is when the white soldiers come back and they want their jobs back, and they notice their neighborhoods have changed, and now we have racial tension in these cities, and some people get their jobs back, and then we have frustrated Black Northerners or we have whites who come back and don't get their jobs back. And now we have frustrated, angry white Northerners, right? And in many cases, lines of neighborhoods have been redrawn racially. And people come back to home isn't what they thought it was going to be because now they have different neighbors, right? So this leads to a lot of racial tension and violence ultimately in the summer of 1919. So 1919 has been referred to as Red Summer. I'm sure your textbook talks about this. And it's not because of red as in communists in this case, like the Red Scare, but this has more to do with blood. That there's fires, there's violence in these places. The worst of the rioting takes place in Chicago, in Philadelphia, and in East St. Louis, Illinois, where there are bad riots as a result of these sort of redrawn neighborhoods and redrawn um, employment levels and statuses that people are going to experience. Um, Another major sort of change in American society during this period is as we begin to move into what's called the Harlem Renaissance. Um, African Americans enlisted in the U.S. Army in the First World War. Some were drafted, many enlisted, with a similar hope that they had had as a result of the Civil War, which was that by fighting for the nation, for fighting for democracy, by fighting for freedom for people from German militarism, that they would be therefore recognized for their service, recognized for their commitment to freedom, recognized for their commitment to the flag as part of the American family, and be able to achieve equal rights politically, socially, judicially. Many came back to find that this was not going to be the case, and led to great levels of frustration. And it led to a belief that among Black thinkers and cultural figures at the time that if we're not going to be allowed to fit into the quote unquote American society, if we're not going to be allowed to be part of American culture, then we're just going to start our own. And this is really what the Harlem Renaissance was about. It was about sort of celebrating African American society and culture in a way that said, hey, we've got great stuff, and we're going to celebrate it. We've got great literature, we've got great music, we've got great art, we've got great food, we've got great ideas, we've got great neighborhoods. Ours is a great society, and if you won't accept us, we're going to celebrate us, and we'll be distinctly. This is going to be distinctly Black culture, uh, and so that's really what the Harlem Renaissance was, a real celebration of uh, the African American culture and society by African Americans. And if you wanted to accept it and enjoy it, great. And if not, we don't need you. Was really sort of spirit behind that. Jazz music does really catch on. That is the one thing that a lot of whites, North and South and Midwest, really take to is the jazz music. I would really encourage you if you have ever seen the Ken Burns series on the Civil War to check out the Ken Burns series on jazz, which I'm a jazz head. And if you look over in the corner over there, you see a lot of jazz CDs over there in the corner. I've got and that's not even my vinyl. As much as I love jam band, I'm a big time jazz head. And so I recommend check out the Ken Burns jazz series. And look at the episodes for the post World War I period, and it really does a nice job of capturing all this. Marcus Garvey, who was a Jamaican-born guy living in the United States, sort of takes us in another direction when he creates what's called the the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And what he's looking to do is he sort of taps into the same sort of cultural and societal theme that the Harlem Renaissance is promoting, and takes it to a business level. Um, and he looks to create sort of Black networks of business, right? So that there's a Black economic if there's going to be a black musical, artistic, literary subculture, that there would be a sort of a black sort of economy. And he begins creating networking and promoting networking between black businesses, and not just in the United States, but internationally, connecting businesses within the West Indies and Africa, and creating black networks of trade and shipping. So he really takes things to a whole nother level. And again, this is he really looks for um, the creation of a completely separate black nationalism. That if we are not going to be accepted into the American nationalism, then we'll have our own nationalism based on our race. And so the Harlem Renaissance and the UNIA are in some ways two sides of a similar coin, with the beginning of a sort of a black nationalist movement, um, both in terms of sort of identity, of both, well, that no longer works because I want to say three things, right? In terms of identity, sort of commerce, and culture. We also see the last gasps of reform at this time, um, in the guise of the 18th and 19th Amendments. So the Progressive Era, which begins during the sort of Gilded Age period around the 1870s, 1880s, is a carryover from reform movements of the early Republic, right? People like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who are interested in banning the sale and use of alcohol. We have all the creation during the Progressive Era of Food and Drug Administrations. We have all sorts of laws, labor laws passed for not just safety, but work hours for women, work hours for children, right? Um, Anti-monopolism, right? Breaking up the trusts, all these different sort of iterations of the progressive movement and the types of reforms that they tried to accomplish in society. Um, the direct election of senators, that was one of the more useful ones, where people actually elect their senators. And the secret ballot was another huge improvement that they had, which is today you walk into a voting booth and you draw a curtain behind you and you vote in privacy and secrecy. Back in the old days, you checked off a ballot and you put it in the box of the guy you liked, so everybody knew who you voted for, and it often led to social repercussions for poor people. Uh, so it was these were huge improvements brought on by the progressive movement. But the last two big sort of things that they got, that they were looking for at this time anyway, were voting rights for women and the Prohibition Act. And both of these are passed in 1919 and 1920. We get the Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, which prohibits the sale and consumption of alcohol in 1919, and then we get full women's suffrage in the United States in the form of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Any questions? Okay, well, that takes us through that lecture on the post-war upheaval, changes in American society following the First World War. Our next lecture, if you actually look at the outlines for this time period that we're talking about, there's a lecture on culture clash in the new era. It's really my sort of new era lecture. So the next lecture we'll be talking about the presidencies of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, and we'll go up to the election of 1928, Hoover's election, and we'll just take us through the 20s, a political overview of the 1920s, before we then begin to talk about the economic problems and the Great Depression. Okay, so I hope you guys are doing really well. I don't see you. I hope it was good to see me. I've had to look at me for almost an hour now, and it's not pretty. So hope you guys survived. Be well, and keep at it. This thing will be over. It will. Just have to hang in there. All right. So I'll look for you guys in the next lecture. I will not be any better dressed than this for the rest of the semester. Okay. I'll look for shirts with buttons, tuxes, ties. All right. So be good, guys. Love you. Bye.